Hey guys, we have a great episode this week, one of our best of all time. We are here with Matt Christman. Just before we start with this talk on the 30 Years' War, we wanted to give some really quick introductory information.
Yeah, for sure, because it's such a vast topic. It's something that really can't be done justice in a single 2-hour episode. But we tried our best and we dug up a lot of really interesting information that we didn't directly touch on with Matt while discussing this great movie. Or at least potentially great in my opinion. There's a bit of a divergence of opinion there.
It's definitely fun.
Yeah, so we talked about the movie and the general overview of the 30 Years' War. What exactly was that? Well, you're about to find out. And like all great stories, it begins with an ominous portent.
Around the start of our destruction, that is not only already well underway in Bohemia, but is now appearing elsewhere. A dreadful comet with a long burning tail appeared in the sky, causing terror throughout most of Europe. With this terrible torch, the God Almighty signaled his place as a preacher of atonement at the high altar of heaven, so that people could see how he would punish them for their sins, and had decided to bring his punishment rod over them, and thereby gave ample warning of damage and admonished them in times of grace to abstain from sin and plead for divine mercy.
Yeah, and that's great. There always seems to be some kind of weird comet or dragon being sighted somewhere or another before the advent of a great catastrophe.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And before we get into the 30 Years' War itself and start our interview with Matt Christman, just wanted to say, guys, if you're liking this podcast, please give us a rating and review. We are really excited to hear what you're thinking. I think that 2023 is going to be a really fun year for this pod. So if you guys have any thoughts, any suggestions for future episodes, any questions about something that might be unclear, just, give me a shout out on Twitter. Drop me a line.
Yeah, for sure. DM us and tell us who your favorite elector is.
Yes.
Tell us who you want to be on the imperial throne.
Yeah. Catholic or Protestant. Yeah, let us know. The story starts in May 1618 with the famous defenestration of Prague. For a variety of religious and political reasons, the nobility of Bohemia, in what's today the Czech Republic, didn't want the Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand II, also the Holy Roman Emperor, to be elected King of Bohemia. So when 3 of Ferdinand's agents met with some Bohemian nobles to discuss disagreements about whether Protestants could or could not build new churches, these angry nobles tossed these guys out of a window and declared they'd elect a new king. They had 2 big demands. Their king couldn't be a Catholic, and he couldn't be a Habsburg. At this time, the Habsburg dynasty controlled not only Austria and parts of Hungary, but also had monopolized the office of the Holy Roman Emperor for centuries. Additionally, they also held the electoral kingdom of Bohemia. Meanwhile, another branch of the Habsburgs ruled the Spanish Empire, which at this time claimed about half the Western Hemisphere. Spanish Habsburgs also held on to smaller territories in Italy and the Netherlands, and had spent the past 50 years putting down rebellions of their Dutch subjects and even fighting with the newly independent Dutch Republic. Meanwhile, another branch of the Habsburgs ruled the Spanish Empire, which by 1618 claimed about half of the New World. Spanish Habsburgs also held on to smaller territories, like Milan and Italy, as well as parts of the Netherlands. For the past 50 years, they'd been fighting wars in the Netherlands, against their own subjects and against the newly independent Dutch Republic. In Spain and in Austria, the Habsburg dynasty was incredibly Catholic. During the period known as the Counter-Reformation, Habsburg monarchs all across the world restricted the power of Protestantism and reasserted Catholicism in certain parts of Germany. All of this led to long simmering resentments of Habsburg domination, both within the Holy Roman Empire and more broadly across Europe. So when these Bohemian nobles revolted against the Habsburgs, they were essentially declaring war on what you could consider an early continental hegemon, and many different figures wanted to get involved. They would elect the young Prince Frederick of the Palatinate as their new king. This guy, from Western Germany, near the border with France, was a hardline Calvinist Protestant married to the English princess Elizabeth Stuart. But when the Habsburgs and their Catholic allies retaliated, Frederick suffered a humiliating defeat at the hand of his Catholic cousin Maximilian, the Duke of Bavaria. Frederick fled the country after just a few months, earning him the derisive nickname the Winter King, because he barely ruled Prague for more than a winter. This could have been the end of the war, but those long simmering international tensions meant that many other countries would join in with the fight. So across the next 28 years, subsequent invasions by Denmark, Sweden, and even Catholic France would prolong the war and devastate Germany. The famous Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus impressed all of Europe with his unusually professional army, and he'd occupy the empire as far south as Bavaria. But he'd ultimately be defeated by the Habsburgs' own genius, Albrecht von Wallenstein, and die on the battlefield. Wallenstein, himself a Bohemian, came from a Protestant background but converted to serve the empire. He was a really new man, someone with really interesting connections to the burgeoning financial world, who wasn't from any kind of great noble background, like Gustavus Adolphus. But after Wallenstein got too strong, he'd be betrayed and murdered by the Emperor Ferdinand. By this point, French and Swedish troops were running rampage across the empire, and the second half of the 30 Years' War would be a period of absolutely infernal chaos for everyday Germans. The loss of life and property in this era was incalculable, but it seems like the combination of disease and famine and slaughter probably killed about 1/3 of the entire empire. This is the world in which the 1971 movie The Last Valley is set. And this is the world we're going to be discussing today with Matt Christman on this week's episode of Gladio Free Europe.
By 1618, the empire was a strange conglomeration of states, which all had varying structures and relations with one another. Some of them were duchies or princedoms, others were bishoprics in the hands of the church, and yet others were imperial free cities nominally governed by the emperor, but in practice under the control of local oligarchs. Some of them were just tiny feudal estates in the hands of a minor knightly family or another. It's difficult to say how many states or entities there were exactly, given the complicated ad hoc structure, but in the early 17th century, it seems that there were around 2,000 such entities. A lot of their territories were even non-contiguous. It was a whole mess. This amalgamation sounds very odd to us today, but it made sense in the medieval context that forged the empire. The big dogs in the empire were the electors, the 7 states who could elect the new emperor upon the death of the old one. These were Bohemia, Saxony, the Palatinate, and Brandenburg, as well as the archbishoprics of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. The Habsburgs used a complex system of alliances and bribes to always elect one of their own to the imperial throne. But some Protestant electors, most notably the Palatinate, were tired of this dominance. This was one of the big motivating factors for the war spinning out of control as it did. Another factor was the question of control. Although the emperor today brings to mind great power and authority, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire really only had direct control over the lands of the Habsburg dynasty. The emperor was supposed to act as a mediator between competing nobles to tamp down on conflict within the member states of the empire. While a lot of historians, especially German historians with a nationalist bent, saw the empire as outdated or unnatural and a disaster waiting to happen, recent scholars like Peter Wilson have argued that it actually served its purpose quite well. But in an age when Europe began to undergo an administrative revolution which increasingly rationalized the functioning of the state, fissures were beginning to show. In that age, the disputes which arose had a religious valence. The Reformation kick-started by Martin Luther would fracture Christendom on a literal level. Where previously there existed one universal Catholic Church which proclaimed a vision of social order into which all were supposed to fit, the new religious tendencies, which were grouped together under the rubric of Protestantism, proclaimed Catholicism had twisted the Christian faith. Protestantism caught on within large swaths of the empire. After a period of religious strife, an agreement was reached which subsumed the question. With the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, the principle of cuius regio eius religio was cemented. That is, the faith of the king is the religion. Catholics and Lutherans could not reach agreement on theological issues, but they agreed that the cost of war would be great to both parties and that theological issues would be resolved at some future date. Nobody was truly happy with the compromise, but one faction was left out altogether, and this would breed resentment and a nothing-to-lose attitude. These were the Calvinists. While Luther soon attempted to put a lid on the torrent which he had unleashed and reconciled his theology with the recognition of the supremacy of the nobility, the Calvinists had cleared away the legitimizing ideology of Christendom and opened the door for a more radical rethinking of the order. The rights of Calvinists went unrecognized within the framework of the Peace of Augsburg. Still, many people, including princes, came to embrace the faith, to the chagrin of Lutherans and Catholics alike. Additionally, in the era of the anti-Reformation, the Habsburgs increasingly wedded themselves to the notion of being the defenders of the Catholic Church. So let's get a princely sectarian lay of the land. The electors of Bohemia, Mainz, Trier, and Cologne were Catholic. The Prince of Saxony was a Lutheran, and Brandenburg and the Palatinate were in Calvinist hands, 4 Catholic, 3 Protestants. In a weird quirk of dynastic politics, the territory of Bohemia had come into the control of the Habsburgs, but as the sectarian question became more heated and the Habsburgs took up the Catholic cause more intensely, some Bohemians hoped hoping to defend themselves from a wave of counter-reformation, took matters into their own hands. And we're right back where we started, the defenestration of Prague. A few Catholics got thrown out of a window, as Bohemians were wont to do, and a call went out across the empire. They were looking for a king. Since this was an elective position, the nobility had a say in choosing its king, and given the threat posed by the Catholic Ferdinand II of Bavaria, who would later become the Holy Roman Emperor the following year, the Bohemian nobility wanted to secure their sectarian rights, and consequently they wanted a Protestant prince. To accept the call would be suicide, but young one prince was bold, and quite stupid, if I may say so myself, enough to take the call. This was Frederick V of the Palatinate. Frederick was a very serious Calvinist, and he came to believe that it was his destiny to strike a blow at the heart of Catholicism in the name of the true Christian faith. So far we've spoken in sectarian terms, but in reality the questions here were much more practical than meets the eye. Beyond this oft-imagined understanding of zealots of competing faiths duking it out to determine who had the correct interpretation of Christianity, as the movie The Last Valley indeed does, there were very real practical implications for this stuff beyond the immortal realm. For one, a Protestant becoming the elector of Bohemia would flip the electoral balance to 4 Protestants, 3 Catholics, which meant that the Habsburgs would likely lose the emperorship, which had been theirs by tradition. Beyond that, the faith of the prince or king or whoever happened to be ruling any particular territory would dictate who got into positions of power. In an age where the inheritance traditions of the Germans meant that with each generation, there were more and more people of noble background who had too little to their name to sate their appetites for power and luxury, to be able to shower your co-religionists, that is your friends, with posts as an opportunity arose meant that the exclusion of one religion or the other could open many vacancies for the ambitious. An overabundance of people who were ready to burn down the whole world to secure their own future spelled doom. Thus the war began and spread across increasingly large swaths of the empire. Many other states in Europe saw this as an opportunity as well. The wide-spanning territories of the Habsburgs made them a force to be reckoned with, one which checked the ambitions of other states on the continent, and outside powers had a very strong incentive to become involved in the war, which had started out as a distinctly internal matter. Some of these powers, such as England, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Sweden, were Protestants, but many Catholic states took a more Protestant, or rather anti-Habsburg, orientation as well. Chief among them was France, but also, funnily enough, the Pope. Thus, it would be incorrect to view the war primarily through a religious lens. The war is usually divided into 4 phases. There's the so-called Bohemian phase from 1618 to 1625, when the war was largely an internal matter, despite the lofty promises that Protestant rulers had made to provide aid to Frederick. Then there was the Danish phase from 1625 to 1629, when Denmark rather weakly attempted to secure more territories within the empire under the pretext of defending Protestants. After that was the Swedish phase, which lasted until 1632, when Gustavus Adolphus, the king of Sweden, succeeded where Denmark had failed by securing large subsidies from France and by bringing the latest advances in military strategy and logistics into Germany before getting himself killed at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. The final phase of the war was the longest. It was the French phase, also known as the International phase. There were ample opportunities to bring the war to a close both after the Bohemian phase and the Danish phase, but the different parties involved continued to press on, hoping for terms which would more solidly cement the defeat of their enemies. Thus, in 1648, with the Treaty of Westphalia, the war would come to an end, largely along the same terms which would be on the table in the late 1620s. But this time, this would be in a Germany with millions fewer people. Many incredible personalities would emerge from this maelstrom, many of whom we spoke about with Matt, such as Elizabeth Stuart, the wife of Frederick. There was the sneaky Maximilian of Bavaria. There was Christian of Anhalt, whose ambitious schemes outpaced his competence by a mile. And, of course, there was the enigmatic Wallenstein, who used his bourgeois skill set to secure an army and many titles from the emperor. There are also many other figures who are less well known, such as Bernard of Saxe-Weimar, who was the youngest of 7 brothers. And finally, a true sycophant, there was Gottfried Pappenheim, who notoriously would flagellate himself for having committed this great sin of being born a Protestant and maintaining that error into his adulthood. Pappenheim would first be greatly injured in the Battle of White Mountain of 1620 and would later die of injuries sustained at the Battle of Lutzen, the same battle where Gustavus Adolphus had fallen. And of course, there were many more figures. So join us as we spoke to Matt about this incredible period, about its many personalities, and the implications that all of this has for people living in our times. But one last note before we begin. I had some technical difficulties during the interview with Matt, so consequently the audio isn't going to be up to its usual standard for this time. But fear not, I've learned from my mistake and it won't happen again. So in the meantime, relax, sit back, and enjoy the show.
Welcome back to Gladiator for Europe. I am your host, Liam, joined as always by Russian Sam.
Hello.
And today we have a very special guest. This is somebody who, for 99% of our audience, needs no introduction. But for the 1% of you who are moms, coworkers, or pets left in a hot car, we are joined today by the incredible Matt Christman.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely. Matt, you are the host of the paradigmatic podcast Chapo Trap House, a longtime advocate for the wonders of both squids and squibs. One of the most exciting commentators on the field, I gotta say. And you're also the creator of a new show, Hell on Earth, which is going to take us through the agony and the occasional ecstasy of the 30 Years' War.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, me and our producer, Chris Wade, we did a podcast last year, Hell Out of Presidents, about U.S. presidential history.
Yes.
And this is 30 Years' War in the context of the rise of capitalism.
Yes. First thing, 2023, is it treating you good so far?
Yeah, lovely. It's going to be great. I think it's going to continue to be great because that's what we all experience, and why not?
Well, so for this episode, the three of us watched the 1971 movie The Last Valley, directed by James Clavell, starring a young Michael Caine as well as Omar Sharif, about a group of mercenaries in the war.
Yeah, I think it's the only, to my knowledge, it's basically the only 30 Years' War movie that's ever really been made.
It basically is.
It's one of two. There's a 30s movie about Queen Christina, who was the daughter of Gustavus Adolphus. But other than that, just a total blank slate in terms of cultural impact within the Anglosphere, unfortunately, I feel like.
Yeah.
So first things first, Matt, how'd you like the movie, and what was your main takeaway?
It's not great. It's got its moments, but you can tell that they're trying for a grandeur that the budget and it really won't allow for.
Yeah.
But it definitely has its moments. And more than anything, I respect that Michael Caine decided to do a German accent.
He's trying. He's really trying.
He was really going for it, and I tip the cap to him on that one.
The death scene at the end, he's really trying his best. Yeah. And I completely agree. There's a few great performances, a few kind of shocking moments. I feel like it looks fun, but the costumes are very kind of, high school play.
Yes, definitely. Like a lot of just stuff that's thrown together, you could tell.
Yeah. I know one of the reviews at the time said that the drama is unexceptionable, but the setting is intriguing. And that's basically why we're doing this episode. Because like we said, it's one of the only English language movies about the war, one of two. It's the only one that really depicts combat of the war. And I think this kind of brings us to a broad kind of first question, which is that the 30 Years' War is so foundational to so much about the modern world. And obviously your podcast is going to be all about that. But besides knowing about the broadest strokes of the war, especially, like the Peace of Westphalia in the political science world, there really isn't much cultural impact in the English-speaking world at all. And part of this is, of course, is the language barrier, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on why do you think this terrible conflict has basically eluded the cultural memory of Brits and Americans?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is that it is something that happened to people who don't speak English, which Americans are not very good at remembering at all.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you put a gun to most people's heads, they'd have a hard time telling you what the 100 Years' War was about or who is involved either.
Yeah.
So I think that's got a big part to do with it.
Yeah, so what brought you to this subject, considering that it's sort of a cultural lacuna for most Americans?
Well, actually, it was suggested by Chris because we wanted to do a follow-up to Hell of Presidents.
Right.
Because, it was something that he had studied a little bit in school and been interested in and intrigued by and thought was an opportunity to talk about something that had not otherwise been really addressed in a podcast form. And I had not considered it really before he pointed that out, but yeah, it was intriguing to me because I had read C.V. Wedgwood's 30 Years' War book about a decade earlier, so I was broadly familiar with it, and I, of course, found it very interesting in that context. So I said, sure, let's do it. And then once I started the research, all these fascinating parallels to the current moment popped up. You could see in the war itself sort of the sinews of capitalism and the new world emerging out of the wreckage of feudalism. And I realized like, oh, this is going to be actually really good. And so, yeah, we've been writing it for about a year now.
That's great. Well, we are very excited to hear. And I think it's coming out, you said the 11th, right?
Yeah, that'll be episode 1.
Great. Well, I'm really excited. On my part, I'm mostly a medieval guy. We've done a lot of episodes on like, the Anglo-Saxons and, the Huns and all that kind of stuff. And then we did a few episodes on the Normans last year. And that kind of got me working kind of up chronologically in time. And so this podcast is coming out at the perfect time because I just read Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. I finally got up to the Tudors. And I'm pretty excited to start learning more about the English Civil War, which was happening at the exact same time.
Yes.
And I feel like that's a pretty kind of funny, interesting connection there. And I'm really glad that I read Wolf Hall ahead of this because I feel like so many of the kinds of political, economic, religious conflicts, both within Britain and more broadly throughout Europe, really don't come to a head until this period a century later.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I do. We end the series with the 30 Years' War, or I'm sorry, we end the series with the English Civil War, and the result of it, and the Glorious Revolution that is the capstone of the entire era of political ferment, because it's that process that leads to the creation of a state in the UK capable of marshaling all of these innovations and changes in economics and religion and warfare towards the end of literal world conquest.
Yeah.
And so that's the chart of the course that we take with it. And it is really one large process. Like the whole thing is inextricable. You can't really look at the English Civil War independently of the 30 Years' War because the cause is intertwined. And one of the things that actually sets a lot of the Puritan opponents of Charles I against the Stuarts is Charles I's father, James's decision to not really intervene in the war.
Not bail out his own brother-in-law.
Yeah. And that ends up sort of setting a stage where James was hoping to avoid bringing the religious conflict of the continent to England. And, thanks to the fact that everyone in Europe was dealing with the same continental crisis, which was being exacerbated by the Little Ice Age, it ended up showing up regardless and ended up, bringing down his own line.
Yeah, and of course, on a much more micro level, this war is the reason why, the third most famous person in the English Civil War after Cromwell and Charles is Rupert of the Rhine, who's one of the kids of Frederick the Palatinate.
Absolutely, yeah, the ultimate cavalier.
He really is, yeah. And then also it's kind of part of the reason why the Hanoverians would become kings, and why basically every king since then has been of like predominantly German ancestry.
It's true, they're a bunch of krauts.
That's right. Yeah, well, speaking of krauts, you mentioned kind of the bigger, broader geopolitical issues of the time. I think that just to go incredibly briefly for anybody who's not familiar with basically the landscape of early modern politics, I think that the real, in a lot of ways, this is especially Wilson's view, one of the texts we sourced from, is that on a more geopolitical level, a lot of this conflict can be understood as kind of a long simmering resistance against the very long power of Habsburg monarchy in Europe. Because during the era of Wolf Hall, a century prior, Charles V had somehow managed to rule over the Holy Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, and therefore like a third of the world. This is a century later. The two halves of the Habsburg dynasty, the Austrian half and the Spanish half, have separated, but they're still in pretty close contact. Austria's motto at this time was AEIOU, Austria est imperiare urbo universo, which basically means that it's Austria's destiny to rule the entire world. A lot of people in Europe, though, don't like this situation. Is that read correct, Matt? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there had been throughout the Middle Ages an idea of a universal Christendom, something that Charlemagne had established as a possibility in the early iteration of the Holy Roman Empire before it started breaking up almost immediately. Someone was imagined in the courts and salons and universities of Europe to be someone to bring back the universal peace that would come from a universal monarch. And the closest anyone ever came was Charles V, went through all those very lucky dynastic marriages the Habsburgs were known for. He came to possess a huge swath, an unprecedentedly large swath of Europe.
Yeah.
But what that ended up doing in the context of Europe after the Roman Empire, where no central authority could dominate, all of the other dynasties which held power oriented their foreign policy around neutralizing the Habsburgs and reducing their threat to carry out that promise of universal monarchy. And though Charles basically gave up towards the end of his life, a broken, hemorrhoidal man, and split up his empire between his brother and his son, that Habsburg power was still, a century later, very overweening, especially considering the massive amounts of incomes and revenue that the Spanish Habsburgs had access to.
Oh, absolutely.
Thanks to their conquests in the New
silver.
World. The silver, yes. Potosi silver mines and stuff.
Yeah.
And that meant that they were still the target of the foreign policy of these other regimes, which by this point had been confessionalized by the Reformation. And you had the emergence of a self-conscious axis, basically, an alliance or a would-be alliance among Protestant states and German princes to neutralize Habsburg power, specifically in Germany, where the Holy Roman Emperor had been a figure who had never been able to assert sovereign authority over the German lands, but had been able to maintain his, justify his reign and maintain his usefulness by being the arbiter of disputes between the sovereign princes of the empire. But the Habsburgs' ability to project themselves as arbiters was neutralized by the fact that they were increasingly seen as partisans of the Catholic side, a Catholic interest in Europe, which led the Protestant forces, both within and outside the empire, to begin marshaling against them.
Yeah, and it's a really long process. Like there's the very long kind of period of the Counter-Reformation where you see kind of the slow tide of the receding of the Lutheran tide. You know, you see places like the Rhineland and Donauwörth become Catholic once again, largely due to somewhat aggressive Habsburg policies. And then you also, of course, see the kind of interesting rift in the Protestant side with the emergence of illegal Calvinism.
Yeah, that is actually the funniest thing, is that Luther's conception was that once we have people reading the Bible, and not just relying on the church to tell them what it means, they will come to the realizations that I have about all the important questions of religion. And almost immediately, as soon as people in the independent Swiss city-states, starting with Zwingli and then Calvin, actually do start reading the Bible, all of a sudden they're coming to different conclusions than Luther, and there's this new strain of Protestantism that is even more hostile towards the secular authorities dictating who will be priests and what their approach to religion will be, and all of a sudden you have this rogue strain of Christianity, this Calvinist strain, that is considered heretical by both Lutherans and Catholics, and is not part of the settlement that had come after the end of the Smalkaldic Wars,
the Peace of Augsburg,
which saw a de facto toleration of Lutheranism, but no recognition of Calvinism at all. But by the early 1600s, the Palatinate in Western Germany, the part that, not coincidentally, is closest to the Swiss, closest to the French, is now ruled by Calvinists also. Yeah. And this is like a sliver within the paw of the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, and I feel like the Calvinists, they just they really faxed and logicked themselves into some just pretty insane and oftentimes kind of repellent, convictions about Christianity.
I mean, we got to let them cook, honestly. They were onto some good stuff, too,
My favorite Calvinist belief at this time was that the entire idea of the Eucharist ended up being rejected because they realized that if the body of Christ goes into your digestive tract...
You got to poop it out.
Exactly, yeah, and that horrified them. So they got rid of the Eucharist. I know Wilson also mentions that the Frisian the Frisian Calvinists used beer instead of wine at communion, which is kind of cool.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, that rocks.
All right. Well, speaking of the church, one thing you pointed out, Sam, is that we talked about the idea of universal monarchy, and there was a kind of similar aspiration of universal sovereignty among the Catholic Church, which is also kind of an interesting factor here. Just in brief, Matt, what role do you think did the church play in like potentially stoking this conflict, in mediating it? What do you got to say?
Well, you have this, as you said, this Counter-Reformation current going on after the initial burst of Lutheran expansion. And part of it is carried out by Habsburg policies. A lot of it comes down to the fact that the Habsburgs are able to disperse offices, able to disperse jobs, and that becomes an incentive for people to come back to the fold if they want to be able to enjoy those benefices. But also you have the creation and then distribution through Europe of the Jesuits. The Society of Jesus of Ignatius Loyola as a Catholic cultural shock troop.
Yeah.
Who become in the Protestant minds the center of a conspiracy, basically, to root out true religion throughout the continent.
Yeah, and they really went crazy with those conspiracies. Like I'm sure it's not a coincidence that the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion, I believe, opens with comparing Jewish people to Jesuits.
Yeah. They're in the Protestant woodcuts and etchings. They always show them with their big round hats, and they're always communing with witches and the devil, and yeah.
That's great. And I guess there was some vague truth to that, only in the sense that there were some Jesuits who had prominent government positions. But as far as I know, there was never any successful, broad conspiracy of Jesuits to reimpose Catholicism on the Lutheran world.
Although they did keep killing Lutheran monarchs and Calvinists, like William of Orange and Henry IV.
Of France.
Those kinds of people. So, I mean, if I was living in that period and I was...
That is true. They did love doing assassinations.
Yeah.
All right. Well, okay, so moving on here. Basically on the topic of, this kind of religious conflict, something that you've talked about on Chapo, which I'm assuming is going to come up in your new show, is the fact that this was a war where after a certain point, the only people fighting were either dead-eyed psychos or religious sickos.
Yeah.
And so we were hoping you play a game with us, Matt. And that
Sure.
is Psycho or Sicko, where we just shout out some figures from the 30 Years' War, and you decide if they are a psycho or a sicko.
All right. Give it to me.
So start us off. The guy who started it all, the boy blunder, Frederick of the Palatinate.
Definitely a psycho.
Okay.
I do believe he was a true believer. He was very young at the time. He was being pumped up by a lot of people who had big aspirations, like his advisor, Christian of Anhalt, who was sort of a classic scheming behind the scenes type guy. And you had his court theologian, Abraham Skoltotis, who was a total
love the name
religious maniac. So I think he was a true believer in his own destiny, for sure, as the lion of true religion who would finally banish Catholic tyranny from the continent.
Yeah, his slogan was "Rule me, Lord, according to your word," and he bragged about having read the Bible 26 times, which really got him far, I gotta say.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah, and he also took a lot of icy baths, kind of doing like the kind of Wim Hof method of the 1620s.
Yeah, he liked swimming nude in the Slatava River after he got to Prague, and the local Bohemians were not happy about that.
I think the only thing that I find in any way relatable about Frederick is just that he was very young and dumb.
Yeah.
And he seemed pretty devoted to his wife, Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of King James.
He did love Elizabeth Stuart.
Yeah, my favorite thing about their relationship is that even though I believe they had to speak French to each other, they got along really well. And he loved her so much that he even built her a monkey house.
If that's not love, I don't know what is. Man, what's stopping you from building monkey house for your girl?
Yeah, but before we move on, the war really kicked off after Frederick was elected by the nobles of Bohemia to be their king. Matt, could you explain what exactly this election was? Because generally when people think about kings and whatnot, they don't think about people getting elected.
Yeah. Well, it's actually kind of a geographic phenomenon. The farther west you go, the farther east you go in Europe, the more likely your monarchy is to be elected, because those centralizing currents that had created the more powerful dynasties of Western Europe didn't really exist in the less populated regions of Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
You had much
Poland.
more powerful magnates, much more powerful nobles who were able to insist on being able to elect their sovereigns. And the Bohemians were the only sovereign monarchy within the Holy Roman Empire. The king of Bohemia was one of the 7 electors of the empire. The rest were princes and prince bishops. The Bohemians had a century before, or over a century before, 200 years before, a century before the Reformation, had secured their own quasi-independent church from the Catholics.
The Hussites.
The Hussites, yes. And it was it's one of those situations where it looks silly when you see what they were actually fighting for and what they got, which was the ability to get both bread and wine at the Eucharist instead of just the wine. They were called the Ultraquists. That's Latin. It means like both. You get both. But what it masked was a revolt of Czech-speaking nobles and vassals against a largely German Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy. And they were successful in fighting a long war with the church that saw them secure their own independent appointments. And they were very jealous of that. They spent the century since agitating from within the context of the empire and from within the context of their elected monarchy to protect their privileges. And they had secured when Rudolph II, who had been the Holy Roman Emperor towards the end of the 16th century, and who was sort of tuned out a lot. He had moved the court to Prague, and he basically just pondered orbs and looked at weird skeletons and talked to alchemists because he hated his family and his his realm was essentially ungovernable. So he basically became a gamer of his time, and his brother Matthias wanted his post, and he made a lot of promises to the Bohemians to secure their support for his ascension, and he was able to basically bully his brother out of the Holy Roman imperial throne, and this raised a lot of Bohemian hopes. And when Ferdinand II was being brought in as Matthias was kind of going out the door, to be brought to be the next Habsburg king of Bohemia, and with it bring the Counter-Reformation that Ferdinand had overseen in his ancestral lands.
In Austria.
Yeah, in Austria. The Bohemian leaders were terrified of losing their privileges. Certain positions, key administrative spots, had already within Bohemia been transferred from some of these quasi-Protestants to Catholics. And that led to this rebellion among the Bohemian elites, which climaxes with the famous defenestration of Prague, which is the second time that Catholics get thrown out of a window in Prague by Protestants or proto-Protestants. It happened during the Hussite rebellion as well.
Yeah, you will never catch me by a window in Prague, ever.
No, bad idea. And so when they throw the imperial representatives out the window, it is as part of a vacation of the throne and a resolution to find a new king. And they wanted someone who was going to support Protestantism and also support the privileges of those Protestant electors. And there were a number of candidates, most of whom, though, refused on principle to even consider it because of how dangerous it would have been. It would have involved going against the Holy Roman Emperor and becoming outlaw, basically immediately by accepting this crown that was being offered by these rebels. The preeminent Protestant elector in the Holy Roman Empire was John George of Saxony.
Yes, big boy.
The big boy, Beer George, who was peace-minded, did not want to rock the boat, hated Calvinism as much as he hated, more probably than he hated Catholicism,
Yeah.
and refused right off. But
Yeah.
Frederick V, who was in this court filled with intrigue, filled with apocalyptic fervor, filled with conspiratorial imaginings, where his advisors had been stitching together what they thought was a strong Protestant diplomatic bloc that could have his back in the event of a conflict with the emperor, decided to go for it. And so the Bohemians elect Frederick king, invite him to Prague, and he accepts. And that starts the entire war.
Right. Yeah, so next up on our list of sickos or psychos, we have, there's been a lot of talk lately about kids getting groomed, and we're going to talk about the guy who groomed Frederick. That would be Christian of Anhalt. Real weirdo unto himself. Could you explain who he was?
So Christian of Anhalt was one of those princes of one of the tiny little ass principalities that was the majority of the Holy Roman Empire. There were a number of large polities, but it was mostly a patchwork of very small territories with a territorial prince. And Christian of Anhalt was one of those, and he was never going to be able to see his personal ambitions satisfied from that position. So he did what a lot of those minor princes did, and he ingratiated himself into the court of a larger prince. In this case, first, the Palatinate, he got in good with Frederick's father, and then by the time Frederick came of age, he was essentially a second father to him. And he had incredibly grandiose designs for the Palatinate and for his groomee. And he's another guy. He with a lot of these sicko guys, it's hard to find the line because their sickoness feeds their psychoness and vice versa.
Right.
And I'd say Christian's one of those for sure. Yeah.
What was the most sicko thing about him, you think?
I mean, the fact that he was willing to start a continental war, that's pretty sick.
That'll do it, yeah.
Like the fact that he spent years meticulously arranging alliances to the end of a continental war. That's pretty sick. Yeah.
Well, speaking of these alliances, obviously there was the Catholic League, which wasn't exactly the same as the Empire and the imperial side. And then there was also, on the opposite side, there was the Protestant League. What do these leagues look like? Do they have much actual authority? Like, what are they doing?
Well, they were military alliances. Essentially, they were the forerunners of the alliance system that would end up leading to World War I, basically.
Right.
It was a mutual defense pact. And the first one was the Protestant Union, which was led by Frederick. Again, the Saxons said, no, thank you. Keep us out of this. And it was designed to protect Protestant interests within the Holy Roman Empire because, as they pointed out, they could no longer trust the emperor to be a neutral arbiter. He was seen as a Catholic protagonist.
Yes.
So it was pitched as this independent guarantor of Protestant rights. And of course, it was also a power projection for Frederick V. And that led to Maximilian of Bavaria to create the Catholic League as a counter.
Yes.
But also, crucially, as a way for Maximilian and Bavaria to create an independent power base that could do its own job of influencing and undermining the authority of the emperor. Because the Maximilian of Bavaria was the preeminent Catholic leader of the empire, although he did not have a electoral vote, and he had his own ambitions for his family, which, by the way, was the same broader family as Frederick V. They're both Wittelsbachs.
Yeah, terrible cousin.
Yeah, they're both cousins, and so both the Wittelsbach ambitions are key to this entire thing. The two branches of this family seeking power within the greater framework of the Holy Roman Empire, and using confessionalism to accomplish that.
Yeah, and I guess this would come to a head this intra-dynastic fight at the Battle of White Mountain when Frederick would be evicted, become the so-called Winter King, only there for one winter, all thanks to the effectiveness of Maximilian's forces.
Yes, it was once the actual shooting started, the competencies and capacities of the two sides were revealed to be wildly different. It turns out that all of the support that Frederick and Christian had assumed and depended on basically fell away. His father-in-law James I had actually no real interest in pursuing a conflict with the emperor. He married his daughter to Frederick, but he was in the process of trying to marry his sons into the Habsburg family. He wanted to play the role of a mediator of continental conflicts, not the instigator of them. So although he allowed units to be raised in England and Scotland and to send troops there, he did not formally support the Bohemian adventure, which that knocked the pins out. Turns out there was nobody who was willing really to give any money to Frederick. They ended up depending on the Duke of Savoy to basically front the money to put a mercenary army in the field for him, commanded by this guy Mansfeld, who's one of the first military entrepreneurs of the war. And they make an abortive attempt to go to Zerg rush Vienna, which gets them to the gates, but they don't have they in order to get there fast, they didn't bring any artillery, so they had no real ability to sustain a siege, and they had to recede back. And in the meantime, Maximilian is building a real military force that is able to cut into within a year of the ascension. Cut through Bohemia and right outside of Prague, rout the Protestant forces at White Mountain, send Frederick and his court streaming out of the city with the derisive nickname the Winter King, because he was only able to rule for one winter before being kicked on his ass.
I know that they left so quickly that they almost left Prince Rupert of the Rhine behind. And then some servant said, "Oh, wait a minute, my Queen Elizabeth, you have one more kid."
Yeah. What about this guy? Get him in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a great setting for a Home Alone.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I know they also when after White Mountain happened, they saved all of Rudolph II's artworks that the Protestants were about to destroy.
Yes, his all of his wonder books and curiosities. Although a lot of those did end up getting essentially heisted by the Swedish army right as the Treaty of Westphalia was being signed 30 years later.
Really? Yeah. Well, that might be why, if any of your listeners are in Los Angeles, if you go to the Getty Museum, I believe you can see Rudolph II's Cabinet of Curiosities.
Yeah. Oh, what?
Yeah, you should check it out. I think it's his. I think it's Rudolph II's. Yeah.
I did not know that. All right, I gotta go.
But all right, talking about the Battle of White Mountain, I think you cannot mention this without talking about the guy who won it, our next psycho/sicko, this being Johann Tserclaes, the Count of Tilly.
Yes, he was from the Spanish Netherlands, and a career soldier, and I would definitely say just a good old-fashioned military psycho. And I don't know how you don't be one of those when you're in your late 60s and sleeping in tents for years during the course of this war, which is what he was doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was 72 years when he sacked Magdeburg, apparently.
72.
Yes, and then he made sure that in the ashes of the burned city, he reconsecrated the cathedral for the Catholic Church.
Oh, that's great. That reminds me at the beginning of this movie, Last Valley, when you see a guy kill somebody and then, beg for forgiveness, praying over the corpse.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. So Tilly, this is like a big question. I don't know if you're going to go into this in the podcast. I don't know anything about the kind of strategic side of this war at all. Why was Tilly considered such a great commander?
I mean, a lot of it is just that he won, like it comes down to it. Like the job of a general in these armies is really much more about logistical management than any sort of real questions about, strategic brilliance, until Gustavus Adolphus comes along, who's able to marshal a whole new body of military science to do like stuff that's legitimately innovative.
Yeah, like having uniforms.
But for the most part, it's about, like Nathan Bedford Forrest said, getting there firstest with the mostest. And Tilly was very good at that.
Yeah, and with a similar brutality to Bedford Forrest too, as you saw at Magdeburg.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, and that was, I was not familiar. This entire town of like 25,000 people, nearly all of them were initially slaughtered and then burned.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Terrible. Probably the most infamous incident of the entire war. I'd say.
Yeah, it becomes its own neologism after the war. Magdeburgization is taken. That's a word that means that an area has been destroyed when it was taken. That prisoners have been massacred. That Magdeburg, it becomes the term for the savagery of the conflict.
And talk about seeing modern conflicts reflected in the past with this kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned Gustavus Adolphus. Tell us about that guy. I know he's usually, I feel like he's one of the main figures people bring up during the war, mostly because of his military reforms. But as far as I can tell, he wasn't really that effective in the 30 Years' War.
Well, he was effective at breaking the stalemate, and most importantly, of getting some W's on the board for the Protestants. When he shows up, the Protestants had basically not won any significant battle. After White Mountain,
if the Habsburgs had sued for peace earlier, they could have won. They could have wrapped this thing up in like 1624, 1629.
Yes, but when you're winning that good, when you're winning that big, there's always the question of, well, what if we push a little farther and get everything we want, rather than have to settle? Because there was the dream that you could really end this entire Protestant insurgency, break this independent power within the empire, because look at what we're doing. We're rolling these people up. They beat the army at White Mountain. They rolled up all of the handful of paladins who decide to keep the fight going after White Mountain. Then the Christian of Halberstadt? Yes, the Mad Halberstadter, Christian of Brunswick, who, speaking of Elizabeth Stuart, was kind of fixated on Frederick's wife. He had a big banner that he went into battle with that said, "For God and for her," referring to Elizabeth. But they rolled up those guys within the years that followed. And then the King of Denmark intervened to try to defend Protestantism in the empire, and he was roundly defeated.
Yeah.
So it was an uninterrupted string of Catholic victories that was finally broken by the arrival of Gustavus Adolphus, who is able to do things that other armies simply didn't have the capacity to at that point. One of the things he does is he intersperses artillery among infantry and increases their effectiveness as a way to neutralize enemy infantry positions. He does at his first big victory, the Battle of Breitenfeld, he does this rolling gate reforging of a line after a flanking maneuver that nobody else had come close to doing anything that complicated on the battlefield at that point. And as a result, he's able to roll across Germany within a year. He goes from the Pomeranian coast in the northeast to taking Munich in Bavaria in the southwest.
Yeah.
But the problem with Gustavus's entire approach to battle is that it depended a lot on his personal charisma and authority, which meant that he, unlike most sovereigns of this period, fought from the front. By this point, very few kings could be found even on a battlefield. And he led on a horse from the front, and at the Battle of Lutzen, he got killed, and it effectively broke the momentum of the entire Swedish intervention. They stayed in the war because the French were willing to pay to keep them in the field after that, but they never again had the momentum that they had until that point.
And after his death, weren't they basically just rampaging?
Yeah, they were going basically where the French told them to go, and where there was where they could potentially, where they thought they could feed their army for the winter.
I've read that the capture of Munich by the Swedes really pissed off the Catholic League, because they blamed the empire, they blamed the Habsburgs for not defending them harder. I think there was even some thought that, maybe they let the Swedes ruin, the strongest Habsburg ally, so there wouldn't be any competition.
I mean, there was a lot of bad blood and mistrust between the Bavarians and the empire. When Gustavus invaded, the French, as part of their alliance with him, made an agreement that he was not to engage against the Catholic League forces, because the French were in the process of negotiating an alliance with Bavaria. Oh,
that's great. I didn't realize that.
Against the Habsburgs.
Yeah, something I've heard also is that I believe a big part of that was that Maximilian's wife, Maria, was a Habsburg, but she was totally against her own family. She really wanted Bavaria to carve out an independent foreign policy, and apparently was a big factor in those decisions.
Yeah, that's true in many of these cases. Yeah.
Well, all right, we're just getting around the end of this list of, the psycho or sicko list. Next one up, I'm thinking this is probably he was an important figure in the late stage of the war. This was after Gustavus Adolphus had died. This is I believe, the last major German prince to keep fighting against the empire, generally for the French, that being Bernard of Saxe-Weimar. I don't really have a good handle on this guy. What's your read?
Bernard was an operator. He was in the tradition of the mercenary captains, really, in that he was always looking for the best deal. He was willing to leverage the French against the Swedes against the French for his own position at every point.
Yeah.
Not one of the religiously fired guys. Definitely someone who is in it for his own personal advancement.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the historiography of this war is really annoying just because German nationalists were all over it with their grubby, fat little fingers. And in the 19th century, they kept trying to paint this guy in particular as like a German nationalist who was specifically fighting for German interests rather than, just doing the French bidding in an attempt to get one up on his 13 brothers, I think it was.
Yeah, exactly.
And that brings us to probably the most prominent non-German, non-Swede of the war. Probably my favorite character because he seems so out of place. Really just this bizarre figure who I believe initially comes in because of the need for a new Bohemian king, and that being the bizarre Eastern horseman Bethlen Gabor of Hungary.
Bethlen Gabor, the swarthy little Tartar, as C.B. Wedgwood called him. Yeah, Bethlen Gabor is a Transylvanian prince who has designs on the Kingdom of Hungary, and is another. And he is a Eastern European Calvinist.
Because Calvin
and another guy who
there.
claims that he read the Bible a million times and it was going to give him superpowers.
Yeah.
And he was a on and off ally of the Protestant cause, but at every point he was willing to take an offer if it was on the table.
Yeah.
He kept sending his horse troops in feints and attacks towards Austrian territory, but would invariably get bought off by his claims to the throne being acknowledged by the emperor.
Yeah. And I believe the one funny thing about him is that he just wanted a crown, and that right before everything happened with the defenestration of Prague, he was about to invade Albania and proclaim himself king of Albania. Yeah,
that whole area there between the Ottoman Hungary and Habsburg lands, the liminal space gets filled with these essentially warlords who are operating more in like a Central European mode than what we would recognize as like the Western European feudal
very medieval that way, and that's very, very medieval in a world that is still in many ways shockingly medieval, I'd say.
Yeah, especially farther east you go.
Yeah. One other thing I find kind of funny about him, just interesting, it's a little small thing, is that his specific cultural background was he was from the group called the CKs of like modern day Romania, the Hungarian speakers in Transylvania. And what's interesting about them is that is the ethnic background shared by a certain Mexican American comedian who I'm not going to name, as well as Count Dracula in the book. He's a CK. Louis
C.K., Dracula C.K.
Isn't that wild? Yeah.
Yeah, that's something.
That is not a joke. They both are. So they're both cousins of Bethlen Gabor. All right. Well, and now that brings us to probably the most important guy of all, probably my favorite figure of all the figures in the war after Bethlen Gabor, somebody who seems probably the most written about character of the war, the most enduring in German cultural memory, thanks in large part to the biographies by Schiller. This is the man himself, Albrecht Wenzel Eusebius von Wallenstein. What is your take on him?
Yes. He's one of the characters who is most prefigurative of what's to come. He brings together he's able to see the contours of this new world being made, and he brings these things together. He is able to see how financial instruments and debt can be leveraged for power, and he basically borrows his way. He marries well and then uses his dowry essentially as collateral for a series of loans that put an army in the
Yeah.
field that becomes indispensable to the emperor, and eventually puts him in a position where the other princes of the empire are terrified of his concentrated power, and he is, after kicking the stuffing out of the Danes, he is forced to resign. At which point, immediately, as soon as he resigns, Gustavus Adolphus shows up and starts wiping the floor with the imperial forces, killing Tilly at one point. And they have to bring back Wallenstein, and he is able to demand this generalissimo position of ultimate authority over the forces of the emperor. And it's because he's able to bring together these logistical technologies and financial ones, but because he is a relatively minor noble who's jumped to ultimate authority, and the other princes of the empire look at him as a mountebank, he is riddled with the same sort of precarious identity and resentment and paranoia of a guy like Nixon. I think of him as sort of the Nixon of the 30 Years' War period.
Oh, totally. And maybe this is just because it's the last book I read, but I also get pretty strong Thomas Cromwell vibes from this guy.
Oh yeah, definitely. He's in the same mold. And what's interesting is that while he has all of these new technologies at his disposal, he's still, when he's fighting, when he's in the saddle, he is still slave to the same dynamic of uncertainty and fate that everybody else is. And so what he uses as the closest thing to a rigorous scientific approach to decision making that he had access to at the time, he becomes obsessed with astrology. And he uses astrology as his main method of making decisions.
Yeah, he was pals with Kepler.
Kepler actually made his horoscope, and he would go into battle, go on campaign, and fixate on finding out the horoscopes of his enemies, and then using that as the template to make decisions from, because that was all that was really on offer for a guy like that at that period of time.
Well, but how tragic that in the end he could not use his horoscope to predict his own fate.
Indeed, that's the one thing you can't know is the hour of your own demise. But he did in his second run in power in authority. He got fed up with the emperor's intransigence and refusal to make a deal at a time when it became clear that there was not going to be the clean and definitive victory that he might have thought was going to happen after White Mountain. And so Wallenstein begins his own secret independent negotiations. He starts talking to the French, he starts talking to the Swedes, he starts talking to the Protestant princes with the overall vision of humbling the Habsburgs one way or the other and reducing imperial authority, perhaps by creating a new Central European state with him as the leader. Or another idea he mooted was bringing all the disparate forces of Europe together in a crusade against the Turks, which had been a age-old technique to try to suppress conflict within Europe, is by getting everybody to band together to fight Turkey, which didn't work. None of that came to fruition, and eventually the emperor, was made aware of Wallenstein's deception, and
he got Operation Valkyrie.
Yeah, and his underlings, his commander, the people below his trusted inner circle, all decided to back the emperor, whose authority was more deeply rooted, and he ends up getting ambushed and executed on his way to Swedish lines in a very red wedding way at what became known as the Eager Bloodbath.
Yeah, and the guy who organized his killing was the Irish mercenary officer Walter Butler.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was all Irishmen and Scots who killed Wallenstein and his courtier.
Yeah. And what I find interesting is that one last little Thomas Cromwell, very oblique link here, is that Walter Butler was cousins with James Butler, who, if you know that name, he was the leader of the Irish resistance to Cromwell's invasion.
Oh, interesting.
Well, all right. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for going over all those guys. One last figure who I feel like to me is a pretty tragic figure, doesn't seem to fit in this psycho-sicko mold at all. I just want to get your thoughts, that being John George of Saxony, who seemed like he was, in a sense, pretty interested in stopping the war, but only made things worse. Is that right?
Yeah. John George is the figure I think that's most intelligible to a modern audience, because he had no real interest at any point in the war continuing.
Yeah.
His strategy was about minimizing conflict. But what that ends up looking like over the course of the war is this kind of frantic and kind of pathetic looking weather vane, where he's going from neutral to supporting the emperor to supporting the Swedes to being neutral again. But all in the interest of not having to fight, of not having to destroy Germany. And when you look at the horror that the war wrought on the German lands, it's hard not to sympathize with his instincts, even if his effectiveness was pretty much nil.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And of course, he was also the only guy, as far as I know, the only prince to survive the entire length of the war, all 30 years.
Yeah, him and Maximilian were the only ones who did not die before the war ended, from the generation that started it.
Yeah. And I guess finally, very last to close this off, I feel like Ferdinand himself never seems to take much of a prominent role in any kind of scholarship about the war. The Habsburgs usually come off pretty poor. I feel like often people kind of see them as, they're creepy and inbred. They all look the same. They're kind of like the early modern McPoyles.
Yes, they got the big jaws, weirdos.
Yes, oh God, the jaws, the lips. So I would love to hear just kind of your last take on the Habsburgs as a whole, both the Spanish Habsburgs, the Austrian Habsburgs. What's your thought with them?
Well, the Spanish Habsburgs are literally a different breed. They are
yes, a different species.
Yeah, they're like the Innsmouth Habsburgs. They're super inbred, hyper fanatically religious in a way that the Austrian Habsburgs, for the most part, were not. They were the ones who they were the most Catholic majesties. They were the ones who took the religious vision of universal monarchy most seriously, whereas the Austrians, enmeshed in the center of the Reformation in Germany, were basically incapable of doing.
Yeah,
like even a guy like Ferdinand II, who is relative to other Austrian Habsburgs a Catholic hardliner, and does push for things like the Edict of Restitution that prolong the war.
And then that was where they said all church property that had been confiscated a century prior now had to be itemized and returned back.
Yes, which guys like Wallenstein, for example, said this is a terrible idea.
Yeah.
This is not going to work. This is only going to make things worse.
Yeah.
And so but he was surrounded by his own coterie of Jesuits and priests and stuff, and he felt a sincere religious commitment, and he felt it his duty to advance the interests of the church to save souls, but also coincidentally, extend Habsburg influence where it had been lost. But even he's still a relatively worldly guy, but he was a sincere Catholic also.
Yeah.
So I have a little bit of sympathy for Ferdinand II. He's not he's not a total lunatic like some of these guys are.
Yeah.
But he also bears a lot of responsibility for a huge amount of the real horror of the war too.
Well, clearly you've read a whole bunch about this war, and I feel like what's really interesting about the 30 Years' War is that this is a period in which media proliferation was reaching absolutely new heights. There isn't as much English language scholarship on the war as you might expect. There's two big books that we both read parts of, Europe's Tragedy by Wilson, and then The 30 Years' War by Wedgwood. But I was really curious to know, what kind of sources did you and Chris draw from when you were building this? Was it just those two especially, or did you go into the broadsheets and the ballads being made at the time?
So we read both of those books. I also read a number of books of just compilations of primary sources. So yeah, I like the broadsheets, the woodcuts, the songs and stuff like that. I definitely went through that.
Yeah, they love their woodcuts.
Yes. I also read another really big book that puts the 30 Years' War in the context of the greater 17th century crisis that was instigated by the Little Ice Age. That's Global Crisis by Jeffrey Parker, which I highly recommend to anybody who wants a sense of what the world was going through in the 17th century. when the global drop in temperatures led to agricultural crisis basically everywhere that you had significant human populations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just a really big fan of Wedgwood because she's a great writer, but also she's very much writing in the mindset where Europe is on the edge of war, and she just can't help but make Ferdinand look like proto-Hitler, essentially, with the same kinds of megalomaniac tendencies and this universal ambition to, conquer the poor Czechs who don't want to be a part of it, and etc. And it's just really interesting from the perspective of how history is written, in that, we generally don't think about the way that our times are going to be influencing what we write. But as I was reading all of this, I was just trying to imagine what, a resistance liberal trying to paint Ferdinand as Trump would, write when trying to do a history of the 30 Years' War.
Man.
Yeah, like Gustavus Adolphus, I guess, would translate into Hillary or something, and then you have Frederick as Bernie.
There's a dang apricot dumpling in the Palace of Vienna.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, that is funny, and it's pretty tenuous. You can't escape the context that you're writing.
Absolutely.
Our take on the 30 Years' War is shaped by climate, and that's not a coincidence either. That's because that's what we're experiencing now, and that's the filter that makes sense of a lot of the crisis that we're seeing in the contemporary moment. So it's going to be reflected in the way we talk about this period.
Yeah, and it also climate is. It's not always at the forefront of our minds, but it's obviously a major part in every conflict. It's always a huge part of our lives. There's a reason why your go-to small talk is "How's the weather?"
Yeah.
Yeah. One really great book that we read about 1,000 years prior to this is Children of Ash and Elm, this book on the Vikings that we did for an episode on the Northmen. And that goes really deep into how a much earlier climate crisis probably led to a lot of the transformative changes of the early Middle Ages. So it's kind of funny seeing that another climate crisis basically ends a lot of those institutions that came around at that time.
Yeah, because at every point, a social world is being made on top of a material base.
Yeah. That
is shaping these institutions. And the institutions then, shape material reality. But it's these exogenous shocks. It's these things that change the underlying inputs that the system depends on that really end up destroying them, because the power structures that exist depend on one set of arrangements. And no one in any position of power will willfully cede their power or do the sort of radical change necessary to adjust the social order to these new array of inputs. And so that ends up being the thing that will inevitably bring about a final end to any structure, because that is the one contradiction that cannot be managed internally within the system itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then in that case, then this is probably the biggest question of the war. But would you say that the 30 Years' War led directly to the end of the Holy Roman Empire?
I mean, yes. The Holy Roman Empire that persists after the end of the 30 Years' War and the Treaty of Westphalia is a fundamentally different position. It's a fundamentally different authority. It's broken in significant ways that are never rebuilt. And by the time Napoleon shows up, he is able to kick down the rotted door and bring the whole thing down. But the reason it was still around that long is because of its largely ceremonial nature. Mm-hmm. By the time the Prussians arise as a power in northern Germany, asserting their own prerogative, there is no imperial response really to that. It boils down to Austria, and the hereditary territories, not any idea that they're going to be able to marshal a empire-wide response that you saw in the 30 Years' War.
Well, speaking about that kind of being able to marshal response and escalate the war as it happened, kind of one last big question before we talk about the movie is that Wedgwood and Wilson have very different perspectives on why the war was so long and so brutal. I know that Wedgwood took sort of a functionalist view, where she believed that armies chose to plunder rather than win decisive battles, which led to reprisals and increased violence and more people joining the army to escape the violence. Whereas Wilson took a much more kind of top-down approach and thought that the war was only so big because so many large countries chose to use Germany as a staging ground for conflicts that they would rather not fight elsewhere, at home. What's your take, basically? Why was the 30 Years' War 30 years?
I think both of those factor in. You have the incentives of the military commanders, which are to stay in the field and to avoid battles that might destroy the armies that they built. But then you also have, especially once the French decide to start bankrolling Sweden, you have this great power politics as part of the greater struggle for influence and reputation on the continent. And all of these things, all of these incentives from all of these actors only flow in one direction. There's no countervailing force to stop it. There's no interest in the war ending other than, the people who are suffering, who have the least political agency. Like the higher you get into any of these hierarchies, be it the military structures or the dynastic powers, the interest in persisting is universal. The interest in stopping, it's an inverted pyramid. All the interest in ending the war is at the bottom of the pyramid where there is no political agency.
Yeah. And that's why it's almost, so many powers were able to jump in on this conflict and kind of graft their own grudges onto this war. It's kind of amazing that other powers like England and Poland and the Ottomans were able to generally stay out of it directly.
Yeah. That's another reason that it was allowed to go for so long, is because it was relatively low cost. I mean, the French had to pay money, and eventually they had to send an army, but they were fighting them over there so that they wouldn't have to fight them at home.
Yeah.
And of course, as a huge long-term consequence, that basically sets the stage for France rather than Germany being the dominant continental power for like the next 200 years.
Yeah, I mean, they did get that, but of course, the whole time that they're focusing on dominating the continent in the old-fashioned way that the Habsburgs had hoped to, the actual future of Europe was being forged in the rest of the world, in the colonies, and by the Dutch and by the English. And
that's true.
And by the 7 Years' War, the France's pretensions are doomed until they're able to, be supercharged socially by the French Revolution. But even that is just sort of a last, supernova burst before extinguishment.
And then you mentioned the colonies. I think one thing that I find interesting about the 30 Years' War is that it was never a world war. It was always fought in a relatively contained geographical area. Mm-hmm. But despite that, it was fought by these powers with these huge empires. But they deliberately chose to keep it limited, which I feel like might have, in some ways, limited the amount of destruction in the war, but also meant that it was just terribly concentrated in a way that especially hurt the German people, that a normal war might not have.
Yeah, everyone dumped everything into Germany. There were the if you take the 80 Years' War as like part of the 30 Years' War, like there is an overlapping there. There is some colonial conflict between the Spanish and the Dutch in the Caribbean and in Southeast Asia. Yeah. But nothing that sees the sort of mass armies and mass slaughter in Germany.
Yeah. And Russian Sam dug up this really great quote, which is a letter from Sigismund of Poland to Wallenstein that just kind of shows the ways that the different powers hoped to use this war in Germany as kind of a staging ground for their own ambitions.
Yeah, it reads, Denmark eagerly wishes to hold peace negotiations with His Majesty the Emperor, but we are certainly not pleased to hear this, since, praise be to God, triumph and victory are within the Emperor's grasp. Were one to continue further military operations, one might easily use such a sizable armada to seize the Danish Straits, and from there, the entire kingdom of Denmark. The King of Spain would also thereby be empowered against his enemies, the Dutch, and we too would be able to regain our kingdom of Sweden much sooner and easier through the aid and assistance of the King of Spain. which is it's perfect sicko behavior, just because like all the pieces are there for this war to end several times over, but people just they want peace on their own terms. They want to
and also I think it's funny. This is Poland saying that. It's like the Drake meme. Like he thinks he's on the team.
Well, I mean, they were the Jagiellon dynasty in Poland were in-laws of the Habsburgs.
It was the Vasas by this point.
Well, they had a claim to the Swedish throne also, so they were like especially mad. Yeah.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
All right, so the movie itself for this episode is The Last Valley. Like we said, it is directed by James Clavell, based on a book by J.B. Pick. What's interesting about this movie is that it's set in the brutal last stage of the war, when most of the Protestant lords have given up the fight, and basically every character we've spoken about, except for Maximilian and John George of Saxony, is now dead. Instead, Swedish and French armies are basically just plundering the country. Croatian mercenaries are running rampage, and the famous Peace of Westphalia is still like a decade away. So this is just like absolute hell at this point. This is probably the most brutal and nihilistic chapter of the war, one of the most brutal and nihilistic chapters of human history. And I have to think that's probably why James Clavell chose this period and this book to make this movie about. Originally, actually, he wanted to make a movie about Philip II, interestingly, like 100 years earlier. He was about to make this big movie about the Ottoman siege of Malta. But then he read this book and thought that it would be a better project. And it's certainly a weird project for him to pick, but it's a very interesting movie. It's not a great movie, but it's definitely one that I'm glad exists.
Yeah, definitely. You watch it and you're like, oh man, like this is just so off of the expectation of what you're going to see in a movie of the period. And you know, like we're talking about how the era that a movie or a historical analysis or depiction takes place, reflecting the moment that it's being created in. You know, the echo of the Vietnam War is very strong in this particular take on the 30 Years' War, because this came out in 1971.
Yeah, absolutely. And the movie ended up being a pretty terrible flop. And I think that was considered part of the issue. Yeah.
People are like, I don't want to see this. Yeah,
it's like a bridge too far. The World War II movie had a kind of a similar issue. No one wants to see a movie about the Allies losing, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a bummer, man. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you showing me this?
I think that James Clavell's problem was picking this book by Pick, because Pick he was a Quaker. And he was so anti-war that in World War II, he was a conscientious objector, and instead he was an ambulance driver. And he had a kind of interesting background. He brushed shoulders with communists in post-war Britain, but only really wrote this one historical novel. Everything else he did was like more poetry, journalism stuff. And he really wanted to show what he saw as kind of the ultimate futility of war, which in some ways seems almost a little bit juvenile, that kind of like very simplistic perspective. But it's also hard to argue against it, especially, you know, in a war like this.
Yeah, just saying like, hey, maybe don't fight. Maybe fighting is bad. You can't get a better piece of evidence than a war where guys just spent a decades plus moving back and forth and just plundering people and not even really getting into battles for the most part. Like avoiding the other armies and just sticking to requisitioning from farmers.
Exactly. Yeah, it was like the Chevauchés in the 100 Years' War or something like that. Just constant low-level violence. And I say low level, but when it's that constant, this basically means that everybody is going to be touched by some extent by the plunder, the massacres, the sexual violence. And that kind of brings us to the point of this movie. It's called The Last Valley because it's set in the only remaining village in Germany that has somehow miraculously been untouched by like 25 years of war. A young school teacher named Vogel, played by Omar Sharif, in a pretty good performance, he finds this village and then is immediately discovered by this brutal squad of mercenaries led by this strange anonymous captain played by Michael Caine in a German accent.
He went for it. God bless him.
In one of his memoirs where he talks about this, he's just basically like, oh, well, you know, I previously adopted a German accent for one of my other roles, and it's quite easy for an Englishman to adopt a German accent. No, it's not. Shut up.
Yeah, he had a lot to say about the movie, and one thing that you kind of rolled your eyes at, Sam, is that he saw it as a very anti-religious war, and he said something like, oh, I hope that people in Northern Ireland can see this movie and stop fighting about their stupid religious quarrels.
Yeah, he got involved in it explicitly as an anti-religious statement, and it just feels incredibly self-exculpatory for this guy to, say, "Oh, those dumb people over there in Northern Ireland fighting over this dumb religion. I'm so worldly. I'm so above that. It has nothing to do with what my state is doing to the Irish at all. It's just."
Yeah. Like second-class citizens. Yeah. What are you talking about? It's just a bunch of petty religious stuff, and the movie definitely emphasizes religion as the cause of the war, as the cause for all the violence. Because Clavel was like a libertarian. He was like an Ayn Rand guy, and like this is very much part of that sort of amorphous countercultural current of the time, which condemned traditional authority, but largely in terms of being connected to old superstitions and to not being rational and reasonable. That's where violence comes from.
And that's why I feel like it feels just like a spaghetti western. Yeah, and drawing that comparison further, I kept thinking about Blood Meridian as I was watching this.
Oh yeah, of course.
Very nihilistic take on a ground eye view on what low level violence looks like. Because often it's these kinds of small roving bands are just as brutal, if not more so, than like a massive army meeting on the battlefield.
Oh yeah, the majority of the violence committed against civilians during the course of the war was not by an army per se, but by these smaller groups. Some of them not even affiliated by that point. Just essentially deserters who had become a de facto highwaymen.
Yeah, and you absolutely see this here. And I think that a lot of the drama is pretty stiff, especially when it comes to the secondary characters that you meet. Like there's one like very virtuous young maiden who falls in love with the main character, and there's another woman who's much much less reputable in this town, who also is a secret witch, and she's intriguingly she's played by a Brazilian actress, which is kind of funny. But I feel like the kinds of drama that these characters get into, it doesn't seem that believable or that compelling, but I do respect the way they try to show the everyday human cost of this kind of a war.
The emphasis is interesting, but the characters themselves never really gel as anything. A lot of the words, you said stiff. That's definitely the word for it. Everyone is very stiff, and I think part of that is because nobody really knows how to portray that era. Nobody knows how to embody, because it is such a weird middle zone between traditional, depictions of the medieval era and modernity. Like that. This whole time period is sort of is neglected in film and art in general, in part because people have a harder time with that sort of liminal historical space. Like if you want a movie about the Middle Ages, you want the Middle Ages, you want the medieval era, you want the feudalism, you want like knights and stuff. Mm-hmm. And if you want modernity, you want modernity. This thing where it's like half one and half the other, and like they're still on horseback and they're still wearing armor, but also there's guns. It's like, what is this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like that with those weird Oliver Cromwell helmets that were just like two little metal bars.
Yeah. Yeah, with the bars in the front, like a punter's helmet.
Yeah. And speaking about the costumes, I think it's funny that it's obviously it's set in the 17th century, but the costumes might as well be like 17th century BC. You have guys in like fur and sandals.
Yeah, they're dressed like Huns.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. Well, that's what James Clavell is a notorious Orientalist, so maybe he thought that like he'd start with his foray into the East by beginning with the Hun.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's basically talk about the movie. The closest thing to a real antagonist in the film is not Michael Caine's character. He's more of almost like a sort of a quasi mentor type figure, I would say, for Vogel, or not really a mentor, but he's not the villain here, because the antagonist is this very stereotypical kind of wicked priest character who's very flat, probably most remarkable because he looks a lot like Mark Hamill, and his whole thing is that he really dominates the town. He takes indulgences from people. This is not from the book at all. This is added for the film, but I think this was just James Clavell's, like you said, his nod towards this kind of base anti-authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Like, if the most powerful person in this town is the spiritual authority, we have to show that this spiritual authority is wrong.
Yes.
Yada yada.
Yeah, and that unjust authority comes from an ability to harness and manipulate people's superstitions.
Yes.
Their lack of rationality. That rationality is what brings real democracy and real freedom, and that religious belief is this miasma that binds people to unjust and arbitrary rulers.
Right. And I think that's why the film turns the captain into a much kind of more sympathetic character, because his whole thing is that he is against any kind of religious conflict.
Yeah.
That if you try to start shit in his mercenary band, he's gonna stab you with his pickelhaube.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. He emphasizes repeatedly that it is that the priests started the war and the priests are keeping the war going.
I think that probably the weakest plot point in the film, because it's not in the book also, it's totally tacked on, is how he falls in love with the Latina witch in the town, Erica.
Mm-hmm.
And she's literally a Satanist, which I really don't find believable at all. And that's kind of shows his soft side.
No, I've always thought this is funny when people try modern day like Wiccans or Satanists try to claim the victims of witch persecutions as part of their
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Because it's like, if you brought these people back and you said that to them, they would be pretty pissed because they mostly went to the stake as believing Christians.
Yes.
Who were being framed by hysteria, and to have them now be retroactively turned in. No, they actually were Satanists, and that's just okay.
Yes, no, it wasn't misogyny and ergot. It was, yeah. No, absolutely. No, yeah. And that's why, and again, that's why it feels kind of like a spaghetti western. It's a work of art that isn't that serious. It feels edgy in a way that's a little bit juvenile. And I think that the scenes of the depiction of violence is somewhat shocking, but it does seem a little voyeuristic and pornographic.
Yeah, and that's very of the time. Like the films of that era were exploring for the first time the new boundaries of what was allowed on screen, and so yeah,
absolutely. It's a much clumsier version of what Peckinpah was doing at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. The battle scene, the actual fight scenes are kind of like slapstick. Honestly, like there's
the combat itself. I agree with that. The combat itself isn't that interesting. Although I really did appreciate the one little thing about the final fight, which was that they basically, as far as I can tell, they did the Barry Lyndon thing, where there was no artificial light in the final scene. They just had real fires lighting the way, and you can't really see what's going on, but it looks pretty damn cool.
Yeah, when they charge across the bridge, that's actually kind of effective. But like when they have the ambush in the woods, they're like jumping on each other, and it feels very goofy.
Yeah.
Yeah, the fight opens with a guy getting shot out of a tree.
Yeah. You see like a 10-year-old kid jump off a horse and shoot someone. You know that this movie was supposed to be 4 hours long, and Sam and I disagree with this point, but I think it's very good that it wasn't.
Yeah, I get the sense that it was the second half was way too rushed for all the character building that happens in the first half. It's just they just go at 2 times the speed for the second half because clearly Clavel, he had a grand artistic vision that unfortunately he wasn't able to bring to its full culmination. I think it would have been a far superior product if he had time to, go the roadshow route, make it a 4-hour-long movie.
Yeah, but what do you think, Matt?
Well, I mean, yeah, a lot of the stuff that's in the movie makes me be like, I wouldn't want more of this. But I also definitely get the feeling of the rushness and of the perfunctory nature of a lot of the plot elements. And I could see them being more effective if they were allowed to breathe a little more, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you actually look at the character of Erica, the witch, why is she who she is, And also, I think a lot of the plot itself in the middle half just seems very tedious. I feel like they could have landed on a better dramatic core than fighting over whether to move a shrine. Come on, that's not that.
The whole shrine thing is
oh my God.
It does not work.
Not at all.
As the instigating, the stakes are very unclear.
Yeah.
The sides are unclear. It does not do the job it's supposed to do there.
Yeah.
But it's very fitting that it's this question of a religious shrine that animates the conflict because that's the whole point Clavel's trying to make about the war, which is reductive and not honestly a real accurate representation, and a kind of fitting that the attempt to do a small scale allegorical reflection of that is similarly unsatisfying.
Yeah. I did it's a kind of a cheesy moment, but I did like the part where Vogel fakes the vision, where Omar Sharif convinces the people that, oh no, actually the Virgin Mary wants us to move this shrine. But everything leading up to that was just put me to sleep.
Yeah.
You had some thoughts on the Vogel character, right, Sam? Because he was kind of interesting. This wayward school teacher.
Yeah. I honestly finished the movie feeling like he's supposed to represent a sort of wandering Jew type, but in a more positive sense.
I don't know if I don't know if the character was meant to be Jewish at all, but I do feel like the implications of this war and anti-Semitism is something that it's been explored by some writers, especially Guts Ali, but doesn't really come up that much in the Wilson and Wedgwood text that much.
It's actually that actually is interesting. You don't see organized violence against Jewish communities as a big part of the war.
Yeah, no, not at all.
The one thing that does happen is that Jews are basically extorted to pay for more of the war than their population would have.
Frederick was very unfair
assumed.
That way.
Yeah, they would be like, okay, we gotta, we're gonna squeeze some more out of the Jewish, the shtetl to pay for this. But there was not, because the religious violence was in this context able to be directed at your fellow Christians. So much more satisfying. I think Vogel is like he's there to be a Jew to the same degree that the modern Western subject is sort of Judified,
right? Because you're not part of this religious paradigm.
We are all by the 70s. We sort of are all that rootless figure,
right? And that's back in Wolf Hall, the character of Thomas Cromwell is very Christian, but people are constantly anti-Semitic towards him because they assume that if he's not part of the system, he must be this Jewish outsider. Yeah.
So Vogel stands for, he's the most modern character in that respect, because while the captain has a very modern view of religion and the war, he is still allied to that warrior ethos. The condition of mankind is warfare, and we must just embrace that to survive. Which Sharif's character clearly is horrified by and has attempted to transcend through a life of the mind. So he's very much the most audience stand-in character.
Yeah, and it's just very interesting that ultimately you can tell that mindset doesn't get him anywhere. At the end of the movie, he's at the exact same place where he was at the beginning, except now he's actually venturing out into the wilderness when he could have very easily stayed in this village, more or less cloistered from the violence. And I just don't really understand.
It's like Shane, but he never helped anyone.
Yes, exactly. He's like, he's Nimoy in the Simpsons episode, just teleports away.
Yeah. Well, I know you use some more general questions, right, Sam? While we have Matt.
Yeah. So we have with that we'd try to get into some more hypotheticals towards the end here, do many hinge point segments, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The Swedish phase of the war was, of course, the most destructive. It was the most violent in terms of scale. And while I was doing research for this episode, I was really thinking that Sweden was tiny in and of itself. It only had 1 million people at the time, but nevertheless, it was really a force to be reckoned with. What do you think would have happened if Sweden had been able to maintain that momentum, and how would they have gone about that?
I think I don't think Sweden was ever going to be able to really assert the permanent power projection that they were going for. Their relatively flat social structure and their weak aristocracy allowed them to do a lot of innovative military and bureaucratic stuff. They're the only force in Europe that actually is able to do conscription of their own population rather than rely on mercenary captains to fill the ranks of their army. But the downside for that, though, is that in a country that, relative to these other European powers, is very sparsely populated, the actual population gets decimated by the war. Oh. In some districts in Sweden, up to 40% of the male population over the course of the war is killed. By the end, they're 15-year-olds are filling the ranks.
Yeah, it's like Paraguay numbers.
Yeah, and that, there was no way that Sweden's ability to continue being a military power was not going to continue to drain the population basin in this place, and then you have the fact that they're locked in this matrix of conflict with Poland and Russia, that I think means that even if Gustavus lives, the Swedes are eventually going to recede back, because you have all of these states struggling to assert themselves in this context. Some of them are able to fight above their weight for a while, but eventually the larger demographic trends end up pulling them back. Like even the Dutch end up being brought low. Not obviously they are not destroyed or anything. They maintain their position as a wealthy Western European power, but their hegemony is short-lived, not entirely because of their relatively small size and population.
Yeah,
but that is something that is always working against their long-term effectiveness.
Yeah, and speaking of the Dutch here, another counterfactual, why do you think the Spanish were so insistent on keeping their conflict with the Dutch separate from this broader conflict? Because you think it would honestly make things easier if they could have just merged that shit, but they deliberately chose not to, which I find very interesting.
Well, they kept trying to. It's just that the Austrians didn't want to do that, is my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the thing, is that the Austrians had no interest in expanding their share of the conflict, because they felt that they were fighting for their own lives there, so they didn't have any, and then they didn't have a direct interest in the outcome in the Netherlands either.
I do think it's kind of crazy though that it's kind of a bag fumble that the Austrians let their cousins get away with taking the Spanish Netherlands, because I feel like if that was part of Austria, that would have made them in a much stronger imperial position, right?
Certainly, yeah. But blame Chuck V on that one.
Yeah. Another question, August, we talked a little bit about the role of France after, and how, as you pointed out, which is, if you could kind of expand on this, how France emerges as a continental power at the end of the war. Louis XIV walks on like it's like the end of a play. He becomes king right as the war's ending. But then it's not really a prize worth having, you were saying, right? Because that kind of continental hegemony doesn't really matter the way it used to.
Yeah, because there's this new possibility that goes from possibility to reality of global trade power, and colonial domination that makes the control of European territory kind of beside the point. Like the amount of acreage that could be accessed for resources in the New World just dwarfs what's available to be fought over in Europe. And a large part of the reason that the British are able to steal a march on the French in the colonial contest is that one of the things that Cardinal Richelieu, who was the major domo and sort of the gray eminence for the first half of the war for France, one of the ways that he mollifies noble resistance to the power of the king is by selling offices of state, which gives an investment in the state to these nobles. But not only gives them an independent judicial authority within the dynasty, but also provides the single most reliable investment that anyone could make. Because if you buy an office, you get the fees and monies associated with that office in perpetuity, and you also have the ability to make it a hereditary office and to ensure it as basically a permanent investment line for your family. And so so the money that capital holders in France have to invest invariably goes to these offices. Meanwhile, in England, the Tudors had done a pretty good job of concentrating legal authority and bureaucratic authority in the monarchy itself, and creating a professional bureaucracy of people who were employed essentially by the crown. And so when people want to invest money, there's much more willingness to invest in the speculative process of these colonial holdings, which means that there's a lot more money going into the colonial project from England than in France, which has the result of making this vastly more effective and profitable colonial sector.
Yeah, like the French just didn't have the juice for it, especially like in the Caribbean. I know they had to call in help from the Knights of Malta to colonize the Caribbean.
They didn't have the juice. Yeah, they had no juice because they never really had the agricultural revolution that the British did either, and that's also key to their eventual domination. But yeah, all the victory ends up happening in the colonies. The most important consequence of the 7 Years' War has nothing to do with, Prussia's ambitions to, annex Silesia or whatever. It's French Canada being annexed by the English.
Well, speaking of Prussia, that kind of brings me to another kind of closing question, which is that this war is always depicted as a tragedy, which obviously it was for 99% of the population. But I'm curious, were there any princes or even like segments of the population, like merchants, for instance, types of people whose lives improved because of this war, or is it just a common ruin?
Merchants in places that were outside of the war zone did very well. I mean, the Amsterdam burghers are probably the number one victors of the conflict itself. Because Amsterdam was well beyond the front line for basically almost all of the 80 Years' War. Yeah. So they got to create this trade network. They built the Atlantic slave trade. They became the financial headquarters of European capital out of the war. So they definitely came out on top.
So while like millions are dying in Germany, they're just playing with their tulip bulbs.
Yep. That's literally like the tulip mania happens in the 1630s. At the same time that in Germany, they're having the most intensive and horrifying witch persecutions of the entire early modern era, because they're actually suffering the consequences and someone's got to pay for it.
And that makes me think that the whole supposed Dutch religious fanaticism is kind of just like for show, right? They probably weren't as anti-Catholic as they purported to be.
Well, they have a fascinating religious schism in Amsterdam within the Calvinist confession. But so in 1609, there's a 12 years truce between Spain and the Dutch, where the northern provinces, which had fought off the Spanish and had de facto independence, agreed to stop fighting with the Spanish, who still held the southern Spanish Netherlands, what's now Belgium. It was an acknowledgement that neither side was going to win in the moment, and so it was to both sides' advantage to stop the war. But almost as soon as the treaty is signed, there becomes a very vehement pro-war side in the United Provinces, led by the House of Orange, which was the preeminent military authority in the area, but also refugees from southern Netherlands who were hoping to get their property back by those areas being taken.
God, you always see that. That's like a universal constant, right? The evicted ruling class pushing for another war.
Yeah, but also people who had made a lot of money profiteering off the war also were invested in getting the war back on its foot. Yeah, and they were opposed by a faction who saw peace as good for business, and they were the Amsterdam burghers among paramount. The conflict, though, between these two sides was not fought on the question of the war. It was instead fought, like all meaningful questions at the time, was fought on religious grounds. Yeah, it was thanks to a Dutch theologian who called himself Arminius, who decided, the strict Calvinist predestination thing, I don't know, man. I don't know. Maybe works have something to do with it. Like maybe there is like a virtue ethic that you have to carry out to like be a good Christian. And this becomes a challenge to Orthodox Calvinism. And these two sides end up going to war in broadsheets and in pulpits over these questions until there is essentially a coup where the Arminians are the leading ones are arrested, and the leader of the Arminian, and also the guy, not coincidentally, who had negotiated and signed the 1609 treaty, John van Oldenbarnevelt, is executed, and the Orthodox Calvinists are affirmed. And you see in that the nascent split in like the bourgeois psyche that we're still living with. It is the dueling conceptions of a Protestant God among those who understand capitalism as transactions in civilized environments, and those at the knife's edge of conquest, domination, that make the actual the sinews of capital happen and accumulate it, and how those two lifestyles demand differing understandings of God's will.
And you've spoken a lot about the unique derangement of American Protestantism, and I guess it seems like you're seeing the seeds of that right here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like they fight over it in the Netherlands for a while until they end up dealing with it by having their very advanced religious toleration, that nobody else in Europe had at that time.
Yeah, that's why, Spinoza, Jewish guys were able to hang out.
But in America, that conflict was managed largely with a spatial fix, where New England Puritanism becomes eventually a Congregationalism and then secular liberalism.
Yeah.
And Southern slave Calvinism becomes evangelical revealed religion.
Yeah. Well, the Baptists were formed in the Netherlands. They were like the Pilgrims when they were still in Leiden. That's where that split happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. One last thing on the subject of the Netherlands. I know that, Sam, you wanted to ask a question about the whole Dutch-Ottoman affinity, right?
Yeah. So there was that famous slogan from the period, liever Turk than Paps, a better a Turk than a Papist, basically. And it speaks to a sort of flirting on-again, off-again relationship between Protestants and the Ottomans. Not because the Protestants necessarily were sympathetic to the Ottomans, but it was more like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So one of the really underexplored threads of the 30 Years' War in general is the Ottomans, because they kept flirting with the idea of sending troops, but then ultimately deciding not to because Persia was starting to war on their eastern frontier once again. So is your podcast going to cover the Ottoman influence or lack thereof in the 30 Years' War?
Well, we mostly keep the Ottomans out of it and bring it back at the end to point out that, like, another reason that they didn't intervene is because they were suffering from the same climactic crisis that Europe was. Like, during the same period of the 30 Years' War, there are a succession of coups, counter-coups. One sultan is deposed twice, two others are executed during the same period, because the crisis is also there. The crisis is everywhere. This is the same period in China that the Ming Dynasty is overthrown.
Mm-hmm.
I never. That's a great. I never even think about that one. Yeah.
So that's the main focus we're going to have on them there.
Yeah, it's great. The entire world was up in flames. Also, Japan, Russia, like everyone was having their fair share of fun.
Yeah, everybody was having a hard time. Interestingly, though, the place where it was probably best to be a European in the world during this period was in New England.
Oh wow, yeah.
By this point, the New England colonies are thriving.
Yeah, we just did an episode on the Pilgrims, basically, and we're going to follow it up with kind of the later 17th century New England history. And they were really up to some. Yeah, they were doing great.
Yeah, because they were able to do all of the things that were becoming increasingly impossible in a Europe where everyone had a claim on all lands, whereas they were able to spread out throughout this area that had been depopulated by disease, and then they were able to militarily dominate.
Absolutely, and that's the great tragedy of it. I think it was that success which led directly to this violent genocide. If they were not thriving as well, they would have needed the cooperation and the help of indigenous peoples. All right, well, I have one last question to close us off, but before we get there, anything else you want to ask, Sam, before we do the final one?
Yeah, you've spoken before about how you think that this period is kind of important for understanding what we're going through and what we're going to be experiencing in the future. What implications can be drawn about our lives and our trajectory from this period?
Well, the big one for me is that our awareness of the crisis that we're in creates this apocalyptic mindset, this sense that things are ending like in a permanent and catastrophic way. And that feeling was absolutely shared by people of this moment. They were putting it in religious terms, a language that we have lost, but their understanding of the precarious nature of the moment was also was existed and was transmitted socially. And it was a horrifying, disaster that befell these people. But while they were experiencing it as this religious apocalypse, below the surface of their ability to recognize that new structures were being built, new accommodations and new mechanisms were being forged, and that they would survive this, and that humans would survive this to come to a new accommodation with the world around them. And I think what's important to remember is that that's also happening now, even if it is impossible by definition to observe and to experience. We are also in the process of building the structures of technology, but also thought and social life that are going to persist in the face of whatever crisis, however the crisis unfolds, and that the world may seem to be ending, but it literally always is.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, for joining us. This has really been a great time. We have one very last question submitted by one of our audience members, which I think is maybe the most important question of all.
Hit me.
That is, if you put all of these princes, all these generals into the Thunderdome, just fists and wits, who comes out on top? Who wins the fight?
Well, if it's going to be an actual physical fight between all of them, I might have to go with Pappenheim.
Pappenheim? We haven't talked about him. Was he the guy who whipped himself for being a former Protestant?
Yes, he was an imperial officer who had been a Protestant, converted to Catholicism, and then vowed to suffer a wound for every year he spent as a heretic. And he was horribly injured at White Mountain. After which his nickname was Scarred Heinz. So I just imagine that he would be a real rangy dude, and that like Gustavus was a plumed, cavalier, but at the end of the day, he was a king. Yeah. He was always in a nice pavilion tent or whatever. I feel like when it comes down to the nitty gritty, I would give it to old Scarred Heinz.
Adult converts to Catholicism never change.
Yeah. All right.
I think that Johann George actually has a bit of an advantage here, just because he was so...
He's a big guy.
Yeah, very
hard
big guy. You can't underestimate how much that confers an advantage.
It's true. A lot of these guys were tiny. The French army in the around this period, the average French soldier was like 5 foot tall.
Oh my God. Thank you again, Matt, for joining us. This was really, really fun. I really had a blast with this, and I'm very excited to hear your new podcast, Hell on Earth.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, take care.